I want to speak about the concept of gender identity. I want to talk about its most charitable interpretation and also some of the reasons I think it's important for us to be careful with how we apply it to young people, particularly adolescents. So if we were to ask a clinician who uses this term, who really buys into this term, they would say our gender identity is a deeply held sense of what our gender is, which is not necessarily tied to the biological sex that we have and the typical gender associated with that sex. So let's dig into this concept a little bit and try to understand it. So I think in its most charitable interpretation, here's what I think gender identity is. Here's where it could be useful. So let's say we were talking about the dysphoric population that we know about in the clinical literature prior to the early 2010s, before the boom of dysphoric teenagers and people changing their gender identity. These would be people who, from a very young age, expressed a very obvious disconnect between their birth sex and their sense of gender. In these cases, it seems like this identity issue emerges somewhat organically and spontaneously. They don't have to read about it on the internet. They don't have to see it in a book. It is just something that the person is expressing and experiencing, which is obvious to themselves and to everybody around them. Now, let's say this person is not one of the 60 to 90% of young people who grows out of their gender dysphoria and they go on to medically transition. They take cross-sex hormones, perhaps they have surgeries, and they live, I guess, full-time, as we say, as the other sex. They pass pretty well in society. They are understood to be the sex that they identify with. And then I think in that case, it makes sense for there to be this concept. It's a psychological concept of gender identity. This person, if we want to be as charitable as we can, we would say this person simply had a gender identity that didn't match their birth sex. Now, this again, it's a theory, it's a concept, and I think it could make sense to apply it in a after the fact kind of manner to the experience of dysphoric people who don't outgrow their dysphoria, who end up transitioning and living in the opposite sex role. But it's kind of an academic concept, isn't it? It's a way of pushing the gender dysphoria aside and instead talking about this internal sense of identity. Now, the reality is for this person in our case study here, they would have been experiencing a very distressing condition of feeling mismatched, feeling very upset about it, and having a painful experience of that disconnect. So I think the concept of gender identity is a way to sanitize the discomfort of that process. And we can treat it as though it's just this normal variant of gender expression and gender behavior, but we fail to take into account the fact that our bodies are real. And whether or not you want to say sex assigned at birth or whatever new terminology you want to use, there is the material fact of the body, and dysphoric people have to grapple with that disconnect. So I think gender identity might be a concept that was used after the fact to describe a person's distress in a way that is a little bit more palatable. I think it's inappropriate, however, to use this concept of gender identity and teach it to everyone, because it's very easy for it to be misunderstood, and I believe we can create gender dysphoria when there wasn't any there. So one of the reasons that I think it's a problem is because the concept of gender identity, when you read about it, relies a lot on stereotypes. Now, if you look at true gender dysphoria, of course it has to do with stereotypes. That makes sense. But when we apply it to everybody who wasn't previously gender dysphoric and you start reading the kind of traits of a male gender identity or a female gender identity, I think many people can notice areas where they don't conform perfectly to their natal sex's gender identity. So these, stereotypes, preferences, interests, and even personality traits are something that we can all relate to at some level, because none of us are going to be at the either extreme end of the pole. So if you are a woman, most likely you are not the most hyperbolic caricature version of feminine. Most likely, as a normal person, there are things about being a woman that you identify with and things about the stereotypical woman hyperbole that you don't identify with. So this is really easy for us if we are reading this concept of gender identity without actually having dysphoria from before, to start questioning, is my gender identity not actually a female gender identity? Perhaps it's something else. Another issue that I have is that reading about gender identity, you'll notice a lot of language around comfort. So they'll say, what gender identity are you most comfortable with? What pronouns are you most comfortable with? And comfort is really an interesting term because it's placed against gender dysphoria as though we have this dichotomy that's very clean and neat. So you're either comfortable or you are dysphoric. And again, to go back to these stereotypes and some of the kind of gender preferences that are used to determine your gender identity, there's a lot of gray area there. So are you, let's say adolescence, are you comfortable with feeling like you're supposed to, as a girl, look beautiful all the time and compare yourself to female celebrities who are, hyper feminine, and of course they're caricatures, right? Because they're celebrities, they're a persona. So are you comfortable with that? Well, maybe not. So when we say comfort, we really can easily miss that sometimes identifying out of a category could be a psychological mechanism. Maybe it's a defense mechanism. Maybe it's an attempt to gain some sort of perceived benefit of the other gender. And even in the DSM diagnosis, there was a clause that is like, it says, not to gain the perceived benefits of the other sex. But what we know about our psychology is that sometimes we're not even conscious of that. That's why slow exploratory psychotherapy is really important, because most people, not just adolescents, most people do things without knowing what they're really trying to gain by that behavior or by that defense mechanism or that coping strategy. So these things are not always explicit, they're not always clear, and they're not necessarily something that a young person is going to be able to verbalize. They may not really understand yet. There's another issue that I think can be really tricky with gender identity, which is that there is a performative aspect to it. So when I was kind of thinking about this, another example came to mind, which is a little bit different, but I hope to tie them in. So for example, I identify as a therapist, okay? My identity is a very important part of who I am. It does frame much of the way I look at the world. It also frames the way people interact with me when they learn that I'm a therapist. So it's an important part of who I am, and it's part of my identity. Well, let's kind of think about how I developed this identity as a therapist, because I wasn't born a therapist, right? So sometime in my life, I started to realize that I was kind of interested in people and why people do the things they do, and I was curious about human behavior. So I studied it in school, and my interest was piqued even more, and I continued to pursue training and education around psychology and around the practice of therapy. Of course, there are some very kind of logistical aspects as well. I had to take certain courses, I had to get a certain degree, I had to take certain examinations and get a license, and I do certain continuing education to maintain that license. So there's that stuff on paper, and then there's the work. There's the fact that I am a therapist. I work with clients on a regular basis, and this informs my identity, and my identity informs my work. So there's this reciprocal process happening between experience and my sense of identity. Okay. When we think about the rapid onset gender dysphoric kids, I think there's a similar process going on there. A lot of them will say that they didn't really feel dysphoric exactly until they hit their teen years and they started to research gender identity. I think this is the key piece. Teens tell me that the more they read about gender identity, the more convinced they were that it describes their experience. So that might be the parallel of me reading about psychology. The more I read about it, the more fascinated I get, the more I feel a strong pull towards pursuing it. So what happens next for a dysphoric kid? Well, then there's the performance aspect. There are things you have to do to kind of earn your way into the identity. So you start by throwing away your clothes, you start cutting your hair, you start buying new clothing and asking people to call you certain things. So this performance aspect gives the illusion that this is a person who is going to benefit from this route. But the route of transition was created to truly help the most dysphoric individuals who have had this kind of life history of a condition that does not resolve. So it's really dangerous for teens to be discovering their gender and moving through this step-by-step performance, which is incredibly serious in the permanence of the medical interventions, and it is creating this again, reciprocal identity between self and the outside world, in a similar way to someone in a vocation moves through the world and interacts with the world and the way people interact with them. So it's really solidifying the identity when a dysphoric person follows the steps, even though they might have just recently become truly dysphoric, or they might have just recently even discovered the idea that there's such a thing as having a different gender on the inside. So for all of the reasons that I shared today, I think it can be a very slippery slope for young people to be taught explicitly about gender identity when they actually haven't been expressing any concerns around gender. This is hard because I think for that charitable interpretation, we might believe that if we just teach everybody about this idea, then we can catch and help all the dysphoric people who otherwise would have been kind of suffering, not really knowing why they have this disconnect. But again, there are some very nebulous aspects to how we understand and define gender dysphoria, and so I think we can end up capturing a lot of other normal human teenage experiences under the umbrella of a transgender identity. So in a future video, I'm going to be discussing in much more detail the concept of gender identity and how introducing it to adolescents can really thwart the developmental process of growth and maturation. So you can look out for that in the next few weeks. Thanks.